My name is Patience Rwabwogo, and I want to welcome you all to this very special time we're having with a very special guest, my mother, my beloved mother, and my friend, the one and only Maama Janet. And I'm going to ask her to say hello to you.
Hello to everyone.
So today we're talking about a legacy of faith. And Paul, in writing to Timothy in the book of 2 Timothy, chapter 1, verse 5, talked about the faith that was shared by his grandmother first, and then later by his mother, and finally in Timothy himself. And when I look at that legacy of faith, that generational blessing that was passed on throughout their family, it just reminds me of Maama Janet's own life and the legacy of faith that she has from her parents and in her own life, and by the grace of God, she has passed it on to her family. So I want to start by asking you, Maama Janet, what are the fondest memories that you have of both of your parents?
Okay, thank you, Patience. And I chose to talk about just one memory that stuck with me, and that was when I traveled with my parents. My father had just received some help from his friend who had a vehicle in those days, and he wanted to take my mother to the hospital, and they included me in that trip, and it was the first time I ever traveled on a vehicle. So when the vehicle was moving, what I could see from the window was the trees moving, and I thought the trees are the ones moving. But I told my parents, and they laughed about it because they told me that the trees are not moving, it's the car that is moving. And that memory stayed with me. I was very little, and I think they just decided to take me with them because they didn't want to leave me home at that time. That's what I remember clearly in my mind.
What are the greatest lessons you learned from both your parents, from your father and from your mother?
I can confidently talk about what I believed blessed me in my whole life by learning from them that God blesses people so that they can be a blessing to others. And as I was growing up, I remember that our home was always full with so many children who some of them were our relatives, but others were not. And so I knew that people are supposed to help others by learning that from my own parents, from our own home as I was growing up. So that's what I can remember. I know that they also helped so many to access education. And recently, when I was serving as a member of parliament in Rwabwogo County, I learned for the first time that it was my father actually who started the first girls' school in Wongera Kajara in Ntungamo district in Rwabwogo constituency. And I was very happily surprised, really, because that was a time when the girls' education was not a public concern. But God used my father to invest love and compassion in an area that he would later on, God would later on in life send me to serve in the sector of education.
What do you feel is the legacy that your parents left to you and to their community?
My parents' legacy to me in particular is the blessing of their name, which I carry. I've been told by many of their contemporaries about the good works they remember of my parents, even in the community where they lived, where I have served. I have met so many people who talked about my parents time and time again. And secondly, I know without any doubt in my mind that my finding the Lord, even long after they had departed, it was not just an accident. It was an investment that especially my mother made in prayer when she was still here. And I had come to their family as an answered prayer from my mother's enduring work on her knees as she cried to God for another child. Hence the name Kainembabazi, which means it is by His grace that we have received a child. Therefore, my parents' legacy goes a long way in explaining who I am as a person today, and I'm forever grateful for their relationship with their God, for instilling in us the knowledge and fear of God, and for teaching us to pray, even when we didn't understand it at that time. But when I finally met Jesus face to face, I understood all those sacrifices, especially my mother made, because my father left us when I was very young, and what I remember a lot is what my mother did as I was growing up. So I know that the sacrifices my mother made in her own life for us also made an impact in my life, and I could understand where her strength came from in her own life.
Amen. It's interesting that when we were praying about a name for the Bible college that was established under Covenant Nations Church, the Lord really brought it up, put it on our hearts to name the Bible college after your parents, my maternal grandparents, the late Edward and Erina Kataaha. And I'm just curious, so it just shows that God really honors the memory of His saints and those who have who have allowed Him to use them in their lives. So as a parting message, what message or what advice would you give to young revivalists and reformers like your parents, those who are following in the footsteps of your parents, who want to have an impact for God in their own generation?
Well, the revivalists and reformers of this generation have a challenge, because while our parents were building the foundation of the Lord's kingdom here in the interior of Africa in their time, today's generation of revivalists must begin to work for the answers to the challenges that face all of us presently. That is, Christians believing that the greater the Christian presence is in a nation, the greater the benefit for that nation. This has been my belief also. However, I happen to be reading a book now that has truly shaken my beliefs, and it questions what we know to be the role of the church, especially in Africa. To bring up one serious observation, I want people to read the following brief story that I am quoting from that book I'm reading. It says, and I quote, "As I visited primarily Christianized nations in Africa, such as Togo, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda, my anguish increases. mission statistics that I had quoted with joy burnt in my mind. She says, Africa, 80% Christian, south of Sahara by the end of this century. Africa, the most evangelized continent in the world, we have said many times. Africa, the most churched continent by end of this century. But in each nation, the story was the same when I visited Africa. Poverty, disease, violence, corruption, injustice, and chaos met me at every turn. I found myself asking, is this thy kingdom come? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven? Is this what the blessing of the gospel brought into the community looks like? In this part of Southern Africa, we have nearly reached every creature, we think. But is this what it looks like when our work as Christians is finished in a nation? God forbid, she says, my anguish increased, unquote. With the dawning revelation that would change my understanding of missions and my life calling, God spoke simply, fundamentally, and permanently. In quotes, the devastation you see is a fruit of preaching salvation alone, without the rest of the biblical message. This is a message of one Christian by the names of Land Corp. I hope that's how her name is pronounced.
Yes.
I believe that it is a wake-up call for the present-day revivalists and reformists, so that we do not spend another century simply doing one thing alone or preaching salvation while people do not know what to do about sanitation, about poverty, about disease, corruption, and chaos, generally speaking. Yet God took time to disciple the nation of Israel in the desert on all these matters. Therefore, the only message I can give to the young revivalists and reformers who would like to make an impact for God in their generation is to simply recommend that the book called the Old Testament Template by Land Corp becomes part of the coursework of the Bible College of CNC. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Mama Janet. Thank you for sharing your heart with us, and thank you for the blessing that you are to us personally and by the grace of God to the nation.